Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very important event centered on turning on the tap here in New York. I think first thing I want to do today is bring on Senator Robert Jackson, who is sponsoring the bill, is the lead sponsor on the bill, and holds the legislation in the Senate to restore TAP in New York State. Senator Jackson is the chair of the city's one committee in the Senate, but also sits on the higher education and education committees. Oh, I'm getting a message that the senator is not going to be able to join us at the moment. That's okay. Minor hiccup in the program. Anyone who knows state assembly people or senators or politicians in general knows that their schedules are very hard to pin down. So with that said, we're going to move right into our first panelists. And so I'm going to let them introduce ourselves, but our first panel is going to be comprised of Vivian Nixon, who's the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, Max Kenner, the founder and Executive Director of the Barred Prison Initiative, and Sean Pica, the Executive Director of Hudson Link. And I don't see why this is a moment where we shouldn't put ladies first. Vivian, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Taiwan, and thank you for having me on this panel. For all of you who have signed in today to hear about this very important issue. I'm Vivian Nixon. I'm Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship. We've been working here in New York City and state and nationally on issues related at the intersection of women's issues, education, and criminal justice for 20 years. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Vivian. Great to have you. Next, I'm going to go over to Sean Pica at Hudson Link. Sean, please introduce yourself. Sean, you're muted.
Hey guys, my name is Sean. I'm the Executive Director of Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison. We coordinate 5 different sites here in New York that offer pre-college, 2-year and 4-year programming to about 600 students with 11 different college partners.
Thank you, Sean. And finally, over to Max Kenner at the Barred Prison Initiative.
Thanks, Taiwan, and thanks for having me. And while it's not the first or the last time I'm on a panel with them, I want to say it's always an honor and exciting to be in a public discussion with either, not to mention both Sean and Vivian. So it's terrific to be here. My name is Max Kenner. I'm the founder, executive director of the Barred Prison Initiative. Like Hudson Link, like CCF, College and Community Fellowship, we've been at this for roughly 20 years, providing college opportunity more or less from the moment or shortly after the moment it was eviscerated at the state and federal levels in the 1990s, and carrying it through to this current moment where we are today, after the restoration of Pell, and really excited to be here. We do this work currently in 6 prisons in New York, enrolling over 300 students full-time, AA and BA level. Alum have gone on across the country and across the world to do terrific things. And it's time for us to do more here in New York and keep our leadership position nationwide. So glad to be here.
Thank you, Max. Thank you to all the panelists. Again, my name is Daiwan Tetro. I'm the Government Affairs Officer at the Barred Prison Initiative, and I'm really happy to be here to moderate this panel today. I got an education in prison through BPI, and so I really know the value of this to myself and what it would mean to others if we expand access. And so I think we want to start off today with digging a little bit into the history, because everyone may not be aware of, the history of college and prison here in New York. So prior to the TAP bans in 94 and 95, there were over 70 college and prison programs in New York. Those bans took that number down to about 4. And Max, Sean, or Vivian will correct me if I'm wrong, but Max, I will begin with you. You want to talk a little bit about, what college and prison looked like prior to 94 and 95?
Sure. So the modern history of college and prison begins more or less in 1972, which coincidentally is the advent of the modern Pell Grants, which kind of ramp up between 1968 and 1972, and also the advent, more or less, of mass incarceration. And so we have through the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s is a kind of counterintuitive, not planned, completely organic, virtuous subtext to both those stories. We're in these prisons as we have this tragedy and this terrible public policy of increasing the number of prisons, increasing the number of people in prison dramatically across the United States. We also have a vessel for organic grassroots colleges popping up within those prisons and creating the most dramatic, the most radical kinds of college access imaginable all throughout the country, but particularly here in New York. And that's particularly here in New York because of the legacy of what happened at Attica and mobilizations among incarcerated people in the 1970s. It happens because of the commitment of religious communities. It happens because of the commitment of in communities where people are from who are incarcerated. And it happens because of the advocacy of incarcerated people themselves, but also the commitment of people who ran the Department of Corrections and people who work for the Department of Corrections. So it's an enormously broad coalition of actors creating this opportunity, which create a real chance to transform the meaning of prison itself. So throughout the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we had college in virtually every prison in New York State. It did more to reduce recidivism. It did more to reduce crime. It did more to reduce violence within the prisons. It did more to restore connectivity between people in prison and their families. It did more to increase employability for people post-prison. And the reductions in recidivism went beyond employability. Even if a person did not get a job after prison, they were radically less likely to go back if they had access to college while they were inside. That's a long way of saying that college and prison did more to do anything that we hope prison should do, might do, than anything else in the system. And it did it more cheaply than anything else. And nevertheless, it was eviscerated by Congress in 1994 with the crime bill, first, and secondly, by Governor Pataki and the legislature here in New York. So I'm sorry, it's long-winded, and Sean and Vivian are experts here, so they should interrupt. But Sean, Vivian, my colleagues at the Barred Prison Initiative, the women at Bedford Hills, we in New York State should be proud that after that national elimination of college and prison, there were a series of incarcerated people, docs professionals, grassroots advocates, and in our circumstance at Bard, young people, college undergraduates, who all came together to advocate for restoration of college and prison, to show the country this was still relevant, and we created more college and prison opportunity with less than anywhere in the United States. And we were leaders for 20 years. And now Washington, D.C. has gotten ahead of us, and it's time for us to retake the lead by turning on the tap.
Max, thank you. You said two things, of particular interest to me is, one, you mentioned George Pataki in 1995, but here we are in 2001 with a supermajority, Democratic supermajority in the Senate, a Democratic majority in the Assembly, a Democratic governor who has tried to expand college and prison before in New York, and yet we still have a tap ban in place, right? And so I want to turn to Vivian in this instant because I think it's too often and too easily to assume that, college and prison is a criminal legal issue, right? That this is an element of criminal justice reform. Vivian, I know you've spoken well and eloquently about positioning this issue as a racial justice issue and an educational equity issue. So would you mind, really expounding for us on, the long history of this in this country of excluding Black and brown people from access to higher education and how the TAP ban falls in the context of that history?
Thank you, Dewan. I certainly will. And I do apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm glad I found my way back. this history has a long country. This country has a long history of making access to especially higher education difficult. But for some populations, access to all education has been an issue. And that pertains to people of color. It also pertains to people who don't have economic means. But as it pertains to Black people in general, you must realize that there have been very few populations where the law has indicated that these people shall not be provided with basic literacy skills. And during the period of our country when there were enslaved people, there were several slave states that passed laws that forbid people to teach slaves to read. Some went as far as to even teach freed Black people to read, or make it illegal to teach them to read. The punishment for teaching Black people or enslaved people to read was equal. Not only did Black enslaved people get punished for teaching each other to read, even well-meaning white people who wanted to educate people in slave states were punished. Some went as far as to have whipping or lashing or death as a punishment for basic literacy. I found this to be horrendous when I learned about it. And I followed the trail all the way through the movements that have gotten us to where we are today. And everyone knows about the cases that denied us access to basic public education, that when we did have separate but equal, it was never equal, it was only separate. And it took us years to get access to basic public education as Black people in this country. Well, that continued as we locked people up in prisons and at first did not have access to college, then gave access to college and took it away. And I felt it was an extension of a policy that was reminiscent of something we want to rid ourselves in this country, and that is structural racism. So that is a really big issue for me. It is about equity. Education is not only tied to what you learn in class, it is tied to how you view the world, how you view yourself in the world, and the value that the world places on your contributions.
Thank you, Vivian. And so I want to take a moment, to ground everything that really has been said in the experience of Sean Pica at Hudson Link. Because Sean, you were, I believe, incarcerated in the early 90s when TAP was taken away in New York following the Pell ban. And you want to speak some on that experience and also, how that experience has brought you to where you are today as executive director of one of the largest college and prison networks in New York.
It's in the 80s, I attended several different college and prison programs. I got moved around quite a bit. When I was 16, I was sentenced to 24 years in prison, and I ended up living in 9 different maximum security prisons over that time. Every time I got moved to a different site, I would just sign up for the college program. But the thing that a lot of folks don't talk about is how when you would get to a new site and you would go to sign up for college, the old timers at those prisons wouldn't let you just sign up. They wanted you to hear and understand how that seat became available. There was a real pride with the folks that lived in these prisons on who got to sit in these seats and how it became available. And I remember taking that really seriously, even as a kid, but also understanding there's a ton of first generation students that were taking advantage of this. But the idea that the first opportunity that I have to attend college, and I'm the first in my family, is because I went to prison. Like the correlation between these things, where we're literally just educating an uneducated population that never had that access before. I mean, Vivian could write 3 books about this history here and how it's just right in front of us. When I lived in A Block in Sing Sing, it's the single largest cell block in the country. It's 2 football fields long. When I'm the only white face in that cell block, you don't need to be a historian to realize there's something very, very broken here. And well, my God, yeah, there's something seriously broken here, and that you could just look it right in the face, no pun intended. I had that opportunity only because as a teenager, those older black and brown men that I lived with would not let me not go to school. They knew that if I was going to have any chance of surviving and really getting a real second chance at life was because I got that value of an education while I was there. Many of those men still are incarcerated 30 years later. So, man, that's a long-winded way of saying so much of what we've created was literally on the back of those men and women that created these college programs and ran them and are still there while I'm now home 15 years and running a program.
And Sean, it's a really, really tragedy. And I think it's been tragic for any of us. I share your experience, got an education in prison, and, to see, men who've been in prison for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, who have associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, kind of wasting away. We know that there's some other important legislation on the table in New York to fix that, and hopefully that all pass. And before I ask the next question, I just want to say if anyone has questions for this panel, please put that in the comment box. And so, Max, I'm going to come back to you. Pell, first Pell is taken away, then TAP is taken away. College in prison, as we know it, is eviscerated in New York. What does rebuilding that landscape look like? And how did you get into this work?
Excuse me. For me personally, I got into this work by way of, unlike Sean, unlike Vivian, unlike yourself, I'm not a formerly incarcerated person. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in New York City in the 1990s when the term mass incarceration didn't exist yet. But these issues were in your face every day. I mean, it's hard to believe that Rudy Giuliani now is ever the mayor of New York City, but it was the Giuliani years and the racism in public policy, but also the hostility toward young people in general was part of everyday life. And I took some time off after high school, then came to college, and I went to college here at Bard in the Hudson Valley. And I realized a few things. Firstly, it was the first time I was ever successful in school and felt inspired by that. But I also, in that inspiration, recognized that I had taken a precise physical trip, a physical journey that was exactly the same as so many other young men like myself from New York City to the Hudson Valley. And I left New York City to come up the valley to go to an institution that was about expanding my future, broadening my horizons, making life more fulfilling, make the world seem like it was my own, and instilling me with a sense of confidence and pride and possibility. And I knew that boys or men, young men, who I may or may not have known or gone to church with or played the Little League with or what have you, were making precisely the same physical trip from the city to the Hudson Valley to go to institutions that were designed to close off their futures, to make the world seem more uninhabitable, to do all the things that were exactly the opposite of what a liberal arts college does for young adults. And I also knew, and it wasn't just me, we were successful because once we started to put words to some of these problems, and it felt original because the language didn't exist yet, it became obvious that these issues were intuitive to everyone of this generation, right? Everyone knew what was happening, even if they didn't know to say it. And so we asked the question, what can a college do in response to this issue? Again, the term mass incarceration didn't exist yet. And we got lucky in that we found out doing a little research that there was something a small college could do that would be of real national significance at this moment when there was so little college nationally. Hudson Link was just getting started. The women at Bedford had just launched their program. And here in New York, we launched really the three of the four privately funded college programs in the whole country that existed in response to the collapse of government investment.
Thank you. I was on Twitter the other day and saw, the Senate Democrats honoring Senator Montgomery as part of Black History Month. And the first thing that popped up in my mind was this event today, because prior to Senator Jackson holding this legislation in the Senate, this had been long time, agenda item of Senator Montgomery. And so I want to turn to Sean. With that said, I'm going to turn to Sean and Vivian and say that, as soon as Pell was passed, banned, as soon as TAP was banned, there was immediate pushback on the ground against those policies, right? People didn't wait 6 months, they didn't wait 3 years to recognize how detrimental those policies were going to be. You, as formerly incarcerated people in that moment, recognized the perniciousness of those bans. So either one of you, just feel free to jump in. And what did that initial pushback look like? And Vivian, I know you've worked with Senator Montgomery here for years and years to restore TAP, and so maybe you'll bring us up to that point.
Yeah, I sure will. And I want to shout out to the women at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility who worked so hard to keep that program together and collaborating with the consortium that provided degrees there. And the women at College and Community Fellowship that were my colleagues when I came to College and Community Fellowship after prison to get my degree. They had all started college at Bedford. I had been shipped to Albion, where there is no college. So, that was devastating for me. But these women had such a passion for college because of what they experienced at Bedford. Well, at College and Community Fellowship, when I was the lead organizer, Belmonette Montgomery was having an event that she sponsored as senator about the issue of women in prison. And there was an agenda. There was an agenda about reuniting with children and about housing and about jobs. And I called her office, and the way she tells the story is that this crazy woman called my office and told me I cannot have this panel without including education as part of the subject matter. So that's how Belmonette Montgomery and I got our start. And she was a champion ever since. And as Assemblyman Aubrey has been. But yes, we did get started right away. We started while we were in prison, and we've kept it going all these years. And Sean was very much a part of that.
Vivian, I remember when Senator Montgomery would come up to the prison when it was the least popular group to talk. I mean, when everyone else was saying we shouldn't have education, she was visiting Sing Sing and talking to the men saying, I will not stop fighting for this. And even though we didn't see change for a lot of years, knowing that there were folks out there, senators in assembly for Aubrey he would never say no for an answer. There was really, it gave us that sense of hope while we were attending classes in that prison. And also, Vivian, I remember I was home from prison after nearly 2 decades and saw you at a Hudson Link event, and you were no sooner welcoming me home to say, have you thought of grad school? Come on, let's get... I'm like, I'm on parole. No. And I went right into an MSW program because you wouldn't take no for an answer. But it was life-changing decisions that a formerly incarcerated person gave to another formerly incarcerated person that changed the direction of their life.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Vivian. And, we've laid out the history here. We've established that, that this was bad policy in 1994, 1995. It's bad policy today. There were people on the ground in the legislature, in prison, in the advocacy community who recognized that immediately, right? And so here we are today. The federal government, under Donald Trump of all people, has restored Pell. A bipartisan Congress under Donald Trump managed to restore Pell to incarcerated people on the national scale. But here we are in New York, again, Democratic governor, supermajority in the Senate, majority in the Assembly. This is a racial justice issue. This is an educational issue. This is a criminal justice issue par excellence, and TAP still hasn't been restored. So I want to talk some about some of the kind of barriers and the arguments against TAP restoration that some of you may have come up against in your work advocating for TAP restoration. But to begin, why at this point is TAP imperative, right? Some people say, well, you just got Pell back. Why do you also need TAP? Max, you want to begin?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say even in the golden age of college and prison, the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, when it was ubiquitous in state and federal prisons across the country, Pell is a smaller amount in real dollars today than it's ever been. But Pell was never, even in the 1980s, enough to run a quality college and prison program. The states that really believed in college and prison, and I'm not talking about the most liberal states, I'm talking about Texas, Ohio, North Carolina, Indiana, and New York was one of them. The states that really believed in this work always supplemented those federal grants with state level grants. And that's the only way we can build a system of college and prison that lasts and is of real quality and really expands higher education, not expands the prison, but expands the college system in New York in a radical way. That's number one. Number two, I just want to go back to some of the anecdotes that Sean and Vivian shared about being incarcerated and what this meant, right? In New York, here now in 2021, we spend over $3 billion a year on our prison system. What we're talking about here is a few $1,000,000 here or there. What was so devastating about the college ban at the federal and the state level in 1994 and 5 was not the money, right? You're talking about a law enforcement bill that dedicated billions and billions of dollars to prison construction. And yet the ban on college was the most symbolically meaningful piece of that bill, because it didn't just say, like George Pataki did the following year in New York, it didn't just say, we believe in prison. It said to people in prison, we believe in the prison. We believe in your conviction, your crime, your punishment, but we have no interest in your future. So you can have whatever politics you want, but college and prison is not exclusively some kind of radical intervention. It says the prisons are here, but we acknowledge that people within them, like ourselves, have a future that we are going to share.
Thank you, Max. And I want to pivot to Sean. You know, Sean, there's a great documentary on the work that Hudson Link is doing. And I believe, I forget her name, but someone who worked for you said that we need to nurture a faith in human dignity. You want to, you know, coming off what Max just said, you know, why now, especially in this moment, should we begin, you know, again, anew nurturing that faith?
Well, I think, you know, I hope the colleges aren't listening right now, but as the director of a college program, I feel like the value of, or the success that we've been experiencing is such a small percentage of the college itself. College is literally the vehicle that we're implementing all of these other pieces of work, including socialization and self-esteem and future reentry work. We're sneaking into the prisons using college and saving lives. This is not about changing directions of life. This is saving lives. If 99% of our students upon release after 22 years have been successful, this is such an amazing opportunity to shift the culture of what prison has looked like over the past 100 years. And it's not even like everyone on this call is paying for it. We're not even asking them to take the next step. We are already implementing this work. We're asking for a tiny, tiny portion of the Pell. Max, what is it? Less than 1% of the Pell grants is such a, like, it's embarrassing that we're even fighting for this.
No, you know, I totally agree. And, you know, the percentage of the total TAP expenditure, as you just mentioned, Sean, that would go to incarcerated people as a result of TAP restoration is less than 1%. And we're talking something about, you know, at max about $5.5 million a year. However, the return on that investment, I think, as we all know, is 4 to 1, right? We have all of the research on our side, and the math says that for every dollar the state invests in college and prison, it saves $4 to $5 on incarceration reentry costs, right? Those are the facts. But we're always asked in this space to bring out the facts, to bring out the data, to try to dignify the work, to justify why someone incarcerated deserves an education. But the facts are not how we got here. right? The facts are not what led to the Pell ban and what led to the TAP ban. So Vivian, I'm going to turn to you, and you want to talk to us about, that kind of conundrum.
Yeah, I think, America has such an identity problem with the values that it articulates in its founding documents and in its rhetoric, and the values that we implement in the way we make public policy. We say that we value freedom, that we value second chances, that we value opportunity for everybody, that we value the dignity of every person. But this is a policy that does none of that. We know that educated people are more likely to retain their freedom over a lifetime, more likely to be part of a society in a way that makes them genuine contributors to our politic. They're more likely to vote, more likely to volunteer in their communities, to do work that is actually about lifting up the human condition. So all of these things that we care about, this is what this population is doing. We also know that it is a great benefit to the next generation. Families who have parental histories of education go on to do bigger and better things, not only in terms of their personal earnings, but what they're able to contribute to the world. Everything that we say we value as Americans is imbued, is infused into these policies that offer people these chances. And I would add that we're in a moment in our history where we are realizing that we have become a little handed with our spending on policing and corrections, that there are other ways to make safe, healthy communities where well-being is the priority. And I think we are moving in that direction where we're trying to create a better balance. So while we're not advocating for more prisons so that we can educate more people, we are advocating for educating more people who happen to currently be in prisons because to abandon them is unconscionable.
Thank you, Vivian. And I also say I think it's important for us to recognize that, in the not so distant history, the value of college and prison was being uplifted by the governor here in New York. And I think I may be misquoting a little bit here, but Governor Cuomo said in 2014 that college and prison made sense because it saves us money and makes our communities safer. And he made that announcement at a church upstate. He invited Max, some other VVI people up to attend the event, and then would push back from the then Republican legislature, withdrew the proposal. Max, do you want to talk about that moment and what we learned from it?
Absolutely. First of all, I'll just be completely honest. I think the governor deserves credit for sticking his neck out when nobody else did, even if it didn't end the way we hoped at that point. So I do think he deserves credit for that, in my view, and I was proud to be there. But what was amazing about that moment and what we learned, even though, yes, the proposal was pulled after a little bit of predictable pushback. If you're Sean Pica, or if you're me, if you're Vivian, if you're one of us who worked in this field for all these years, when you were articulate, I want talking about all the people who recognized this was horrible policy in the 90s and early 2000s. But it's also true that there was visceral anger and hatred about this work in that time. The person who stuck through this the most in New York, who's now retired, Bob Houserath, used to go out to dinner in his community and lie about what he did for a living because of the way people would respond. So if you're Sean, if you're me, we used to kind of be afraid of our own shadow when we talked about the work. We used to always kind of apologize for it by saying how little it cost or reduced recidivism or all this stuff, which I'm sorry if this is wrong, Sean, but I think I speak for both of us, and I know I speak for Vivian. We don't really care about that stuff, right? That's not what inspires us to do the work. But that's how we talked about it, because we thought other people would think it was wrong for whatever reason. We're not going to get into that now. What happened in 2014 was incredible. Even though the governor backed off, we had, for the first time in history, actual public polling on the issue. And it showed us that a demonstrable majority of New Yorkers, double-digit majority of New Yorkers, supported the work. So the people that were the loudest and the meanest and often the most racist were the ones we always had in the backs of our heads. But when there were actual scientists who know how to do this kind of thing, measuring what public opinion was, there was a majority for it.
Thank you, Max. I think that's really, really important to note at this juncture, especially, for anyone in the legislature, anyone in the assembly who should be thinking, like, why haven't we done this yet? Right? You should be thinking we need to do this now. Right? And so with that said, Sean, Vivian, you have anything else you want to add before we move to questions in the next segment of the event?
I want to. Yeah, it's okay, Sean. Just very briefly, I think it's important because I've done so much work in New York, including getting the State University of New York to finally take the felony question off the front page of its application. I want to say that in every field, in every discipline, in every group of people, including people who are at high levels in the departments of corrections, who worked in programming, Linda and Jeff and the former commissioner and the current commissioner have partnered with us on this issue. And I don't want to discount their gracious understanding of how important this was, their realization of what it was doing for the people that they had control and custody of. And I want to honor that, as well as all of the other advocates that we've worked with in the community who have backed us up, and the colleges, and of course the folks in the legislature who have backed us up. But now it's time to act. There's no better time. You've got the federal government sanctioning this policy. You have histories of New York being successful in implementing. Now is the time.
I was just thinking, Vivian, that we're talking about safer communities, investing in these men and women, the savings, the return on investment to our own state. But we also have to include the fact that we are creating safer environments inside as well. And Commissioner Nucci said when Governor Pataki made that announcement in 2014, he said, my role as the commissioner in charge of thousands of men and women that are incarcerated doesn't revolve around recidivism. I'm in charge of them while they're inside. But if there is anything that can be implemented that creates a safer environment for the staff, the officers, or the men and women that I'm in charge of, my God, don't we need more of that? He said, when my phone rings at night, it's never good news. It's never someone calling to say, hey, everything's good at Sing Sing. They're only calling when there's a problem. So if there's something that keeps that phone from ringing and creates a safer environment in these prisons, it only has a rippling effect on how everybody views this work as they return to their communities.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Vivian. And, I'll just add, in my experience doing Pell advocacy at the federal level, I would get on those calls and, there'd be one or two people from the Department of Correction on each one of those calls lobbying federal legislators to restore Pell. And so, across the board, even from the people who hold the keys, this is recognized as imperative, especially in this moment. So Max, Sean, Vivian, thank you all. If you have anything else to add, please feel free to jump in now before we move into the next panel.
Daiwan, Max, Vivian, it's great to see you.
Same here. It's always great being with you guys.
Yep. Thank you, Daiwan. And just to echo what Vivian said, we've all been at this for 20, 23, 25, 26 years, and New York has been in the lead for so much of it. And now is the time to do this. There's no excuse.
Great. Thank you. We're going to move to the next segment of the event. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're going to move straight into the next panel. And so on our first panel, we really dug into kind of the political aspects around TAP restoration, as well as the history and why it's imperative at this moment. On this next panel, we want to have a different kind of conversation around the value of education in prison, especially at the individual level. And so on this panel, I want to introduce you, Rob Scott, who's Executive Director of the Cornell Prison Education Program, and also Darnell Epps, who is now a qualitative analyst with Ithaca S&R, and who started his education in prison. So let me first turn to both of these gentlemen and ask them to introduce themselves. Rob, please.
Thank you, Daiwan, and to everyone who organized this panel. This has been really interesting to listen to, of course, Vivian, Max, and Sean. And this is an interesting format where you don't get to see those who are attending, though I saw in the comments the folks who are joining us. Thank you for participating in this conversation. My name is Rob Scott. I'm the director of Cornell University's Prison Education Program. I advocate for college and prison because I see education as a vehicle for fighting inequality, for social change. And specifically in the prison environment, it is vital that we not understand this as some sort of situation where this is about like party A fixing party B. One of the things I find so lovely about the way this is set up is that we've got so many directly impacted voices who are now leading the discourse about this. So education, higher education specifically, as I see it, has been one of the main ways in which we can set up a bi-directional exchange and really give voice to people who've otherwise been banished from the public square. I'm talking about folks who are incarcerated in America and here in New York State. We're talking about racial and economic disenfranchisement of people who've, really not had a chance in most cases to go to college before they were in prison. And now, due to laws passed in the 1990s, when they present themselves as ready and qualified and prepared to go to college, still finding themselves excluded due to the ban on the tuition assistance program, or TAP. And so I'm honored to be part of this group that's here advocating for repeal of that ban. Sorry for the long intro. I realize
No. Thank you, Rob, and thank you for being here. Darnell, you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dewan. I'm Darnell Epps, qualitative analyst with Ithaca S&R. I'm a graduate of Cornell University, class of 2020, and a former student of the Cornell Prison Education Program. I'm very passionate about education equity and prison reform. I've written about these issues in op-eds for Pell restoration. I've written in the New York Times about geriatric parole. So I'm very much passionate about this work. And a lot of the work I do with Ithaca S&R as a qualitative analyst is to advance technological equity on behalf of incarcerated college students, because I fully appreciate the value of having an opportunity to enroll in college in prison. It really changed my life, the trajectory of my family's life. I'll be attending Yale Law School in the fall of 2021, which is amazing, after having served 17 years in prison on an indeterminate life sentence. To now have the opportunity to attend the #1 law school in the country is a dream come true. And I couldn't have done it without the efforts of the Cornell Prison Education Program and programs like BPI and Hudson Link that have devoted themselves wholeheartedly to this cause for so many years. And really, it's long overdue that we restore tuition assistance on behalf of folks who are inside. And I really want to use my voice to bring that to the attention of anyone who can make a difference in this area.
Thank you, Darnell, and big congratulations from us all on your acceptance in the Yale. I was trying to save that for later, but thank you. It's really, really, really big announcement. So thank you. And so programs like Cornell, like Hudson Link, like BPI, individuals like Sean, Max, and Vivian, you've been really, really working hard with little to no public funding support to expand and rebuild college and prison in New York, right? So I want to talk about, but how hard is it, today for an incarcerated individual to enroll in a college program? I got an education in prison. I'll tell you right now, from the moment I decided that I was going to enroll in college, it took me 6 years to get from the facility I was in to the facility where BPI was teaching classes, right? And that's the scarcity of college and prison in New York State. I took the test with over 150 individuals. Only 15 of them were able to be accepted. So, Darnell, what does access look like in the prison?
I mean, it's very difficult to enroll in college within the prison system. I mean, as of 2017, 2.5% of the total adult male prison population was enrolled in college. I think when I first met you, Dawan, when we were in 5 points, before you transferred to Eastern to participate in the BARD program, I don't even think 5 points had a college degree program at that time. And you couldn't request an educational transfer. You could request to be transferred to the hub of a particular area within the state, but there was no guarantee that you would land in a facility that was actually offering college. And then for the facilities that do offer college, the number of seats are very limited. You just mentioned how it was very competitive enrolling in a BPI program when you arrived at Eastern. It was the same when Cornell arrived at 5 points. Very limited number of seats, 1,500 people in the general population. There are many obstacles to even applying to enroll in college. Minor disciplinary infractions could disqualify someone. Other programmatic requirements might deter or prevent someone from enrolling in college. And the irony is that earning college credits, at least 24 college credits, is a requirement for earning your limited credit time allowance, which can reduce someone's minimum term of imprisonment. So here we're not funding this, we're not providing resources so folks can participate in these programs, although participating in these programs is part of the requirements of earning a reduced minimum term of incarceration. So not only are we talking about educational inequity, we're talking about, inequity just throughout the criminal legal system, right? In terms of who serves more time in prison and who doesn't. So if we're going to make this a part of the requirements for someone to earn early release, we have to at least provide some funding and to make sure that these programs are available to everyone and that it's not so arbitrary and that folks have to hope to be transferred to a facility that offers college and prison. I myself, I dropped out of school in the 10th grade. I never really seen myself as an academic. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I was brought up in the 90s during the era of Comstat policing, zero tolerance policies in New York City public schools, stop and frisk. And there was no follow through when I dropped out of school. I was just a blip, a statistic at that point, although we know now through the school to prison pipeline that studies show that for someone to drop out of school, that's one of the biggest indicators that they'll have contact with the prison system at some point. But it was, and it took 12 years. When I arrived at 5 points, I was there with my brother. We shared a cell for 10 years. And I never wanted to leave the facility with my brother, which kept me there, right? And it took 12 years before they actually adopted or we were able to take any college courses, and 16 years before a college degree program was actually being offered at that facility. So
that is a huge amount of time. I remember the first year that I took the exam at BARD, it was with another student who had spent the past 7 years testing to get in. He got in that year, by the way. But you spoke about kind of the percentages of people participating in college programs, Darnell, and there are currently 15,000 individuals incarcerated in New York who have either a GED or high school diploma. Less than 1,500 of them, less than 10%, have access to higher education. So I want to turn to Rob. Rob, and quite frankly, how many more students can you enroll with public funding? What would public funding, TAP, do to help expand access to college and prison with respect to, the program at Cornell and in New York State in general?
Yeah, great question. Let me take 1 second to say hi to Darnell. We kind of just jumped on here. And people outside of the COVID era won't get this video, but we do live in the same town, just in Ithaca, just outside of Cornell University. But because of COVID, we never run into each other. So hello. And I should say, the modesty, Darnell, is basically, this man is now, the pride of Cornell. And you barely mentioned the acceptance to Yale Law School and now being an analyst for one of the top research institutions of the world, overseeing one of the largest humanities research databases in the country.
The modesty.
Well, right. But so, it's then, let's talk about Daiwan's question here. How many more students could we enroll if TAP were? I mean, so, we got to be careful. I saw the first panel was very good about this. Yes, funding is one of the main ceilings that is hit by colleges and universities that want to do higher education in prison. But I just caution that we want to look at, avoid the logic of expansion when we're talking about the simultaneous desire to de-escalate the use of prison, more and to avoid like any kind of logic that suggests we're trying to have some kind of growth industry because we're going to do so well if we get TAP grants or Pell grants. We're going to make a bunch of money and have expensive classrooming. The prison population has shrunk by 25% in New York State since COVID-19 began. The system is getting smaller. What we want to talk about is the transformation of the infrastructure that remains for incarceration and the reduction of the scale of incarceration to that which is in a more reasonable, equitable, and ethically justifiable way still warranted. So I think the more interesting thing for us at Cornell, we've been in this work for a few decades, but for much of the time we weren't offering a degree program yet. We ended up partnering with SUNY to offer an associate's degree. And it was a while before we expanded to multiple prisons. Darnell not having access during those 12 years, that's partly the structural issue. It's also partly because it like Vivian and Max and Sean were talking about, the discourse environment, this was difficult to justify. Taking dollars that people were taking out on loans to pay for Cornell and then directing them off of campus is challenging any population, let alone the prison population. It won't be the only thing that's needed to get there, but I would say that I think that institutions such as Cornell are now much more optimistic about the potential that we could run bachelor degree granting programs for people who are incarcerated. But it's also going to take, as Max mentioned earlier, private dollars, university, public policy, and the removal of really the draconian restraints that were put in place in the 1990s, and the TAP ban is one of those.
We can't hear you, Dewan.
Oh, there we go. I was muted. I was saying that, excuse me, everyone. I was saying, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Darnell. I said it's unfortunate that we live in a state where that has taken college and prison programs for granted for the past 20 years, right? But I want to pivot some here. And I know my experience in prison, I did 12 years in prison. In that time, the programming that I was offered during my incarceration by the Department of Correction has had no relevance in my life. I haven't been able to use one bit of it. I walked out of prison, the prison handed me $40 and a bus ticket and said, report to parole, right? If I hadn't had a degree from BPI, if I wasn't going on to bar to finish another degree, if I hadn't had BPI's reentry supports, I don't know what I'd be doing today. So Darnell, Rob, whoever wants to jump in first, you want to talk about, what programming looks like in prison absence college opportunity?
Well, vocational instruction is entirely inadequate, right? It's underfunded, it's outdated, and it's not designed to really prepare someone to gain to earn a job upon their release. I mean, I earned my GED in 2001. I was 21 years old, and I had to fulfill a vocational requirement, as does mostly everyone who's incarcerated. And it just did not provide me with the skills that would, translate into me being successful upon my release. Number one, your time in these vocational courses is limited. They do not allow you to remain in these courses for an extended period of time. So once you earn your certificate, you're removed from those programs. And for me, I was serving a 17-year to life sentence at the time. So I earned my vocational certificate within the first 3 years of my incarceration. There's no way that at year 17, were I to be paroled, that I would be able to use those skills that I took up in a plumbing and heating class in 2003 and find a job on the outside. I'd have to go back and to school all over again, right? Pursue some kind of vocational training in that field all over again. So the programs that the vocational instruction that's sort of mandatory or is mandatory in many respects, is not adequate to prepare people for success upon their release. And these programs are underfunded and just do not equip folks with the skills needed to find a meaningful job. I will say that out west, you see programs like the Last Mile, which aren't college degree programs, but for instance, they teach folks digital literacy or computer coding skills and they have a low recidivism rate over there as well, right? And through their program. So it's higher education in prison, not necessarily college in prison, but it does equip folks with 21st century skills that will help them find a good job upon their release. But that type of program has not been implemented in New York, and we're relying on a totally different system that is not adequate to meet the needs of the folks inside.
Thank you, Darnell. I'm going to just turn to Rob. And, Rob, in your experience here, students coming into your program, they've had vocational programming or some other programming from the offered by the Department of Corrections. Why are they coming to you, right? What is the value of higher education in prison?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the paradigm, or in a sense, which is also then informs the policy pivot that TAP restoration implies, is that intellectual life is in opposition to violence and conflict, to develop skills, social skills, language skills, to learn that one's emotions are mentionable and manageable, to recognize that we are people in history, that we are people in a society that has structures that are not only chosen by us. All of these are the things that we talk about in daily life on a college campus. But it's very challenging, from everything I know, as a one of the non-incarcerated members of today's conversation, in the everyday life of the prison culture that prevails. So it takes intellect and knowledge to advocate for justice and to break cycles of conflict and violence and to re-engage with society. And that's why I think that higher education is, in fact, perhaps one of the best vehicles for transforming what we are thinking about when someone is sent off to the criminal justice system, when someone's sent off to prison. And so I think that, if anything, one of the unnamed agendas here, or maybe the unnamed curriculum, if you will, is to continue to permeate the walls of the prisons that we have with the normalcy of the thoughtful people that come from these campuses and bring regular assumptions of conduct, of respect, of dialogue, of listening, and of using evidence to make arguments and thinking critically into the space that otherwise is, due to the culture that was really created by the 1980s and 90s and these policies was set up mainly to be punitive, and to hammer it into people that they're not going to be able to be something else. So that's how I see it. It's really about changing the culture of how we treat people.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rob. I value my education a ton, having a liberal arts education and reading, people from Baldwin to Foucault was very, very fulfilling for me. But I also recognize, 3-4 years post-release, that just as important to my education was kind of the resocialization process that happened in the classroom, right? You go from an environment that works to marginalize and isolate you to one that is looking to nurture you, right? And so how I interacted with my peers set a baseline for how I interacted with my coworkers when I first got out. How I interacted with my professors set a baseline for how I interacted with my bosses in the workplace when I got out. So, I'm 100% in agreement with you on that point, and really, really want to thank you for surfacing it here in this conversation. And so to dig a little deeper into kind of the value of college in prison, we've seen college in prison often reduced to kind of a metric of recidivism. So it's going to lower recidivism by X, Y, Z. It's going to reduce crime by X, Y, Z, right? And I think that's a poor way to think about, how education shows up in the life of a student, Rob, in your life, Darnell, in my life as a person. So Darnell, I just want to, I want to ask and begin with you. How's your educational experience changed your relationships? How's your experience impacted your family?
It's a very good question. I mean, this I always say, college in prison has intrinsic value, right? It's not something that it's quantifiable in terms of any particular metric focused on recidivism or higher job prospects, right? For me, when you're in prison, you're exposed to, two dominant cultures, the criminogenic environment and then the corrections culture. And you can, succumb to that and think that there isn't a pathway for you into society, right? And in a way, that can creep in the back of someone's mind. And, for me, college and prison was so timely. I had lost my final appeal. I didn't know if I would ever see the outside of a prison again. So there was this kind of narrative lurking in the back of my mind that all you would ever be is a DIN number, all you would ever be is a statistic. And I used college. College for me became a way to kind of defy that narrative. And regardless of whether I was ever released, I could always grow intellectually, and I could always be an inspiration to my family. And, many of the folks inside, they come from communities that have been devastated by mass incarceration. I remember growing up in Brooklyn in the housing projects, and people weren't talking about taking tours of college campuses. They were talking about stints on Rikers Island and Fort Maine. And these were 16 and 17-year-olds, right? These were folks that didn't even have college as a thought, but would talk about the experiences of going to one of the most notorious jails in the country. And it was common. For me, how it's affected my relationships, it's affected them in quite a profound way. I'm the first in my family to graduate with a bachelor's degree.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And, my nephew, who was not yet born when Daryl and I entered the prison system, enrolled in college because he was inspired by the experiences of his father and me. And we used to talk with him about the course materials we were going over in some of our courses when he would visit us in Romulus, New York, traveling all the way from Brooklyn. And he grew up in Brownsville projects in Brooklyn before moving to Queens. So one of the toughest neighborhoods, right? But yet he defied that narrative, right? He defied that, he found hope through us. He was inspired through our story. And I remember reading a letter he wrote to the parole commissioners where he described us as the smartest people he's ever known. And right there, you know, I realized the impact we had on his life. And now he's on the verge of earning his bachelor's degree. And we were able to make it home to see him graduate high school. But, you know, it's through the work of programs like the Cornell Prison Education Program and BPI that helps restore not simply individuals, but their families, and to provide hope to families. I ask anyone who's listening to this to just attend a graduation ceremony at one of these programs and look at the faces of the family members that you see. Look how inspired they are, tearing up, so proud of their loved ones. I mean, this is a tremendous you know, opportunity for not just the folks who are receiving their education, but their families and their children. There are many people who are incarcerated have children, they have wives, they have mothers, brothers on the outside. And we want to help make not simply the individual whole, but the family and the communities whole as well. But regardless of whether somebody is getting out one day, we have to understand that providing college is providing purpose, and to tell someone that they're not entitled to have, they don't deserve to have hope, is cruel. And I think we always have to give that opportunity to folks to better themselves.
Thank you, Darnell. And I just want to mention that, you know, I know both you and your brother Daryl, and Daryl, I believe, is at Columbia finishing his degree. I'm on the board over at Fortune, and he's on our staff over there doing really, really amazing work to change the circumstances on the ground that lead into incarceration. So big shout outs to both of you guys, you know, who walked out of prison and kind of really, really working to do some good in the world. And we hope to have other people be able to do that. So we're coming up on the end of this panel. And so maybe a couple questions briefly, and we'll move to final thoughts. Rob, what are some of the common misconceptions that are that you're confronted with relation to your students?
Misconceptions. Well, that's an interesting question. So I would say what I've seen, I got involved in this work originally as a graduate student in a PhD program concerned about educational policy. 2007, walked into a classroom in a prison because I'd been involved in community police relations activism. And I would say mainly since that time, I've seen a pattern of students perplexed by their own ability. You know, the TAP ban does this on its own. It tells people in prison, you are not college material. Having been told explicitly and implicitly that they are not capable in many cases for their entire lives. I've just had to, you know, have so many people say they can't believe they're passing high caliber college classes. Like, I'm sure there's others from the previous panel as well that can attest to this. People start wondering whether there's some sort of like crazy simplification or dumbing down of the curriculum that we're doing at Cornell. It's an extremely common discourse amongst us. I mean, it's because of the pounding in of the message that incarcerated people must somehow be incapable of intellectual life. And that's no accident. I mean, you know, we've repeatedly fall back into policies which we think are about making the world safe that actually show complete disrespect for the minds of people once they've been convicted of a crime. Remember just a few years ago, we were talking about restricting the books people had access to in prison in this state, 2018 or something like that. I mean, that's just one more way in which the message goes out. You can't choose the books you read, and it doesn't matter what you read. We're going to choose for you. And so the TAP ban, I think it's gone stale on the shelf. I mean, what we're really talking about here is pushing past our misconception that people inside aren't capable of a college education and therefore should be the only group that we exclude from this form of educational support, which is there for those who are the poorest in our society economically.
So Darnell, I've heard you describe, you know, talk about the TAP ban as kind of like a function of a lack of empathy, right, in the state, in our society. Do you want to expound on that for us?
Sure. I remember reading a work by William Stuntz, who passed away, The Collapse of American Criminal Justice. And he argued that in order to have an efficient criminal justice, criminal legal system, you have to balance empathy for the person who's anger for crime with empathy for the person who's incarcerated, right? And in order to do that, you have to be able to see the folks inside as your neighbor's sons and your neighbor's daughters, right? And, I kind of point out this kind of divergence of opinion with regard throughout the state, right? Areas that are most impacted by crime in the downstate area, politicians from those neighborhoods tend to be more progressive, more willing to extend these opportunities to folks who are inside. Whereas counties where Denimora or Elmira or other counties throughout the state where crime is not as much of an issue, the likelihood of being the victim of a crime is far, uh, is diminished in those areas, tend to be the ones who are more opposed to providing these opportunities to folks inside. And this is where the question of empathy kind of intersects with racial equity, right? Is it that folks who are politicians from the downstate area are just more empathetic because they see the brown and black faces that are inside as the daughters and sons of their neighbors, as people who are not incorrigible, who are capable of getting past the worst choices they've made in their lives and making amends. Empathy and forgiveness go hand in hand. But in order to forgive, you have to recognize the humanity of the person. And I think that's a problem. And I think it intersects with race in so many ways, unfortunately. And that's why you see the way that plays out. But yeah, if we just focus on anger for crime and not providing adequate resources to people who are inside to change their lives, we're just going to have an overly punitive criminal legal system as we've had throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But if we're going to have empathy, we have to equip folks who are inside with the ability to get past some of the worst decisions they've made in their lives, to make amends with folks in their community, to give back to their community, and to make their families whole.
Thank you, both Darnell and Rob. And, I think maybe if I can summarize, everything that we've discussed here on this panel, sounds like, we're at an urgent moment in this state where we need to be prioritizing people and education over prison and punishment, right? And we see the amazing work that Cornell's doing in this space. We see the results of that with people like Darnell going off to Yale after doing 17 years in prison, and many, many other alumni of the Cornell program, as well as BPI, as well as Hudson Link and all the other programs doing this work in this state, valuable work that the state is not supporting, right? We need to turn on the tap in New York. And so I'm going to thank our panelists, and I want to turn the conversation now over Senator Jackson's Chief of Staff, Johanna Garcia, is going to join us for some words on this issue. And we're really, really glad to have the senator and their office pushing this legislation.
Hi, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Apologies for the senator not being able to be here with you. This is an incredibly important issue for him, especially as the former co-chair of the Black Latino Asian Caucus at the City Council, and especially when it comes to education. Look, we all know that this society, this nation under capitalism especially, has used the system of incarceration as modern day slavery. I'm sure that these are things that have been touched upon, and it allows for society and our government processes to dehumanize the individuals that are currently incarcerated, and also to kind of wipe their hands clean of how society failed so many Black and Latinx communities, where individuals ended up where they were, or where the system just failed them completely in terms of the judicial system. And we have an opportunity right now to right the wrong that was implemented in 1995 that claimed that individuals that are incarcerated are not worthy of improving their lives, of looking towards what life is even after incarceration, of uplifting their minds and continuing to contribute to society in a productive way. We are so happy to be on board with so many of our coalition partners. This conversation is not just an important one today, not just important because it's Black History Month, but it is a conversation that needs to happen beyond the limits of 28 days of February. It's a conversation we have to have every day until we get this legislation passed. I'm hoping that with a new administration in the White House, with a supermajority in the Senate, with a new chair of the Committee of Criminal Justice in the Senate, that this will be the year that we finally bring a semblance of justice and dignity to those that are currently incarcerated. We need to invest in them now.
Thank you, Johanna. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to your office for leading on this issue. I now want to turn to, we have a question from the audience. It's coming from someone from Aaliyah from Senator Salazar's office. Senator Salazar's the new chair of the Correction Committee. I would say I'm really, really happy to see her in that position. I'm going to read the question. How would we be able to place Turn on the Tap on the agenda so that the program can receive more attention? So one, I'll say that, people have been pushing for about 20 years to turn on the tap here in New York. But over the past 2 years, coalition of college and prison programs, formerly incarcerated people, advocacy groups here in New York have been really pushing the formal Turn on the Tap campaign. And so we're going to continue doing events like this, engaging over social media, doing constituent meetings, lobby days, advocacy days in Albany, really to make some noise around this issue and communicate to the Senate, to the legislature, that now is the time to turn on the tap, that now is the time to turn on the tap. And so we're going to be pushing this issue, and we look forward to working with Senator Salazar's office. I believe the senator signed on to the legislation to get this over the finish line this year. So I just want to end and thank everyone for being here and end with some closing remarks, right? And so just to talk about and emphasize the value of college and prison, it is stark in my life. I have an older brother who's been to prison. I have a younger brother who's been to prison, and the types of opportunities that have been available to them as a result of them not having had the opportunity to go to college and prison are stark, and the type of opportunities that I have had walking out of prison with an education, with a degree, and into an academic community, into a network of BPI alumni that has really allowed me to propel myself in life. So the value of this in my life and the lives of all college and prison students and alumni is really stark, and we should never underestimate that at the level of the individual. Too often in the criminal justice space, and as I said, this is not only a criminal legal matter, this is about educational equity, this is about racial justice, but too often in the criminal legal space, we're reluctant to invest in people. And we're talking about an investment here. Let's be clear that TAP is a cost-saving mechanism. For every dollar that the state invests in TAP, restoring TAP is going to save $4 to $5 in reincarceration costs. The amount of TAP expenditure that is going to go to incarcerated people is going to be less than 1% of the overall TAP budget. It's going to be no more than $5.5 million a year. So we're talking about a very little bit amount of money that is going to do an enormous amount of good in this state and correct some really pernicious history. So we do not have to be scared of this issue. The dollars make sense. The value of it, I think, is unquestioned. And the moment is now that we have to restore it. We need to prioritize people and education over prisons and punishment. And so again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you all our panelists. Thank you to Senator Jackson's office, and I'll be seeing you all around in Albany via Zoom as we continue to push this issue. Have a great day, everyone.